wherever you are. My name is Arun Gupta. I am the Vice President and General Manager for Open Ecosystem Team at Intel. You can find all about us at open.intel.com. You see the banner right behind me. And we have a beautiful podcast as well at open.intel.com/podcast. If you want to be a guest, if you want to show up on that podcast, shoot us an email and we would love to connect with you. Fantastic. Today, I'm super excited. I have very prestigious Al Gillen, who has been leading, who was leading open source and product development research at IDC. And of course, I have my esteemed colleague Rachel with me, and we're going to have an excellent conversation around open source. Hi, both of you.
Hi,
Hi, Arun.
excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us.
Excellent. So maybe let's start with some introductions. Al, you want to go first?
Sure. So I'm retired. I don't have a job. So, no, joking aside. I actually spent a pretty long career in the IT industry. I began as a developer back in well, late in the last century, let's put it that way. I worked my way into a role as an IDC industry analyst in 1999. And for the next 24 years, I focused on both open source software as well as a number of secondary markets and or should I say adjacent markets, including things like operating systems, application development, and topics like that. So I did my opening quip. I did retire very recently, so I've only been out for a couple months. So I still remember most of what I learned over the years, and I'm really happy to share that today in this podcast.
That's wonderful, actually. 99. My God, that seems like that is indeed last century. And we're going to have some fun conversations around that. Rachel.
Yes, I joined Arun at Intel a few months ago as Director of Open Source Strategy, and I have been in and about that community for a while. I was the chair of OSCON and have focused on helping create content to educate about all things sort of technical and open over the last, I don't know, not as long, quite as long as Al, but for a little while, for a few years.
Yeah, I mean, if I think about it, between three of us, we are talking about 50 to 60 years of open source experience. And that's pretty dangerous. So we can have some really good, fun conversations here. So maybe, Al, let's go back to your time at IDC. Back in 1999, open source was still like a hippie thing, and it was happening on the fringes, not mainstream as it is today. Over the years, what are the trends have you seen starting from 99 where you are going and talking to, say, Microsoft or some other company and telling them about open source versus today over the last few years?
Well, funny you should say. Funny you should say Microsoft. Back in 1999, Microsoft didn't really want to talk about open source software. Microsoft's perspective back then was very, very, very different. Like completely different than it is today. Microsoft today, of course, is a huge proponent of open source software, is a big contributor to open source projects and so forth. Back in 1999, Microsoft was still in a different state where they were largely just discounting Linux as being really being a real thing, as open source as being a real thing. So a funny thing, as I mentioned, I did retire recently, and I was cleaning out my office, and one of the things I found was a document that I published. And it's from 2000, and I just want to read two sentences out of this because it's just kind of interesting. There's a section which was focused on Linux, and by the way, for the purpose of today's podcast, you could replace the term Linux with open source more generally because I think it still applies. And what I wrote back then was Linux is the spoiler of the server operating system market, breaking the licensing cost model much the same way that Windows NT broke the Unix pricing model in the early 1990s. And that Unix broke the mainframe pricing model before that. But the price alone is not enough to pave the way for Linux into corporate installs. And for the foreseeable future, the business model of Linux server operating systems will be for the vendors that sell ancillary or cooperative products and along with a Linux operating system. So in other words, we've got this model where you can sell Linux, but you really need to sell a portfolio of other things around it. And frankly, I'd have to argue that in a lot of respects, that's kind of where open source has moved from and is going to today. And if I kind of take a kind of a retrospective look at Linux, I think it's true to say that certainly in the 1990s, it was seen very much as a curiosity, as a hobbyist kind of a thing, not something that real businesses would use. And it was very much an outsider technology. And in fact, we did some research back in 1999 at IEC in 2000. And one of the things that we thought was fascinating was that if you asked the CIOs, are you using Linux and open source software? They say, absolutely not. We don't, our policy prohibits it. You ask the guys that are charged, or the men who are charged with standing up, web servers and email scrubbers and things like that, and what have you. These people would tell you that, yeah, we're using Linux. It's not sanctioned, but we don't have the budget to buy a Unix system. So we're repurposing our retired x86 servers, and we're using them with Linux. So it really was a kind of an underground movement where Linux was working its way into the corporate world at some level without the visibility on the part of top management. So that was kind of the beginning point. And what has happened since then is that there's this whole life cycle we've gone through where starting out as an outsider technology and slowly over time building more credibility, getting endorsements from companies like, certainly Intel has been extremely supportive of Linux and open source software for a long, long time. But IBM also made a lot of noise in the early 2000s around their $1 billion investment in Linux. And those kinds of events help put the word Linux and the term open source software up onto the board so people would recognize that, okay, this is maybe something real. And what happened over the next decade is that open source software continued to evolve, continued to be, established its presence and being used in certainly, it got to a point where it was being used with the permission and the sanctions of upper IT management or CXOs and so forth. And over time, it began to evolve and grow. And one of the things that's also, I think, one of the most important things to note about open source software is that when Linux began, and at the time people didn't like us to say that, but Linux was a follow-ship technology. The Linux community was trying to rebuild a Unix-like operating system that didn't have any licensing fees associated with free software. Right? And in that sense, the goal was pretty well known. We were trying to emulate all the best parts of the Unix operating system, and Linux was not breaking new ground back then. And frankly, one of the other things, open source software databases emerged, late in the 1990s and early 2000s. And the same thing, we had these gold standards with things like the Oracle database, and we knew how a database was supposed to work. The industry understood that, and the objective was to build something that worked equally well that was based on open source software. What has happened since then? And I think to me, this is one of the most important things to note with open source software. And I think we can apply this next thought to where the industry goes as we go forward. And that's that over time, open source software development shifted from being a follow-ship technology where we're trying to rebuild things that already existed, only using a different licensing or use model, to a scenario where today, open source software is a leadership technology. Something new that gets invented today typically is invented as open source software. So the new things that are being created that didn't exist before are created first in open source software. And that is fundamentally different than what we did before.
That's beautiful, actually. And the way you explained it, that earlier there used to be disconnect between sort of the on-the-ground workers and the executive management. Linux was used all over the world, in the ground, but executives were like, no, we don't use it. No, we have licensing deals signed up and we're sticking with that. But as that gap kind of closed up, that's when sort of it changed from fellowship. We're like, oh, let's change Unix to Linux and make it open source. Instead of that, now it's a leadership element where when people are thinking about new technologies, they are leaning towards open source. Like, let me do it in open source way. Why do you think that? What are the core advantages you think, in your opinion, that, see, when we all understand the benefits of open source, but what is in it for enterprises to leverage that open source as a business model?
Well, I think there's a number of things. Probably most importantly is organizations have long been concerned with being locked into a particular vendor, and proprietary software historically was something where you bought it, you put your built your systems around that proprietary solution, and if the time came that you were dissatisfied with the vendor you're working with, or maybe the vendor you're working with was not doing well financially, and you felt that you needed to change to a different vendor, it became very complicated, very expensive to shift gears. The industry made a lot of efforts. I mean, if you think back into the 1990s, we had a lot of unification efforts around Unix. We're trying to bring all the different Unixes into a common set of APIs and so forth so that you could move from one Unix to another. Ultimately, that was unsuccessful. And Unix, there was what, 3 or 4 major Unixes. And the reality was that they remained unique and different to themselves. And the customers never had the benefit of being able to move from one place to another. So that's the first benefit, is this notion that if company A is not doing well, company B can step in and begin to offer a service based on the same open source software technology and take it going forward from there. So that's important. But the other thing that I think is important is that most organizations, I think today, realize that the innovation is coming from open source software. And organizations want to make sure that whatever investments they make, the thing that comes next is going to be compatible with what they're investing in today. And by going with open source software, you got a pretty good chance that what you're investing in today is going to be the foundation or is going to be integrated into whatever comes next.
I think another thing, another way to put it is that developers live in the open source world. And so you're making it accessible, you're enabling them, you're meeting them where they are, is what we say a lot of times. One follow-up question to the Linux sort of underground. Do you think there's anything today that's like that? Or are we all a little bit too educated around technology? Like Gen AI came to mind, but everyone's on top of that all over the place. Is there anything that's happening where there is a disconnect that you see sort of like burgeoning in the tech world that we might not be thinking about?
Well, the answer is probably yes.
Yes.
It's because it's underground. I don't know what it is, but I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if something kind of popped up that that had been simmering for a while, and suddenly kind of the time is right, the technology needs are right, and that technology kind of comes in and fills that gap.
I think the way I see this is, I was listening to Hard Fork. It's a New York Times podcast by Kevin and Casey. Kevin works for New York Times. Casey works for Platformer, and they do this podcast every Friday. And this morning they actually had Demis Hassabis, who's a Google DeepMind CEO, and they were having a discussion about open versus closed. And he was talking very openly about it, that what are the pros and the cons of open versus closed AI models and all. And with AI being the hotness everywhere, I think the biggest difference that I see, earlier, executives were very shy about or reluctant about talking about open versus closed. Now those discussions are happening out in the open. So I think that undercurrent of the disconnect that we were talking about earlier is less likely to happen, because I don't know, the developers have come out with a pitchfork, or they are a lot more vocal about it. It is open. That's what I want to embrace, and that's how I want to go with. So I think, but again, it's probably more so in the tech-centric company, less so in the end user company.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. The tech companies, because they live and breathe and live and die, frankly, within what's happening in the surrounding technology world, they have to be in tune with the changes that are taking place. And I want to circle back to a comment that Rachel had made about developers. I mean, when we think about developers, developers, you're right, have lived in the open source space for a long, long time. Developers have long been of the mindset where they want to try before they buy, right? They want to just fool around with the technology, make sure it works, build a prototype, do a proof of concept and that sort of thing. And they don't want to pay to do all that experimentation. If it works, then then they when they want to flip that over and turn it into a commercial deployment, maybe that's the time and place for them to think about what's the support model going to be around that particular stack of technology they're using. But again, the developers themselves are very comfortable with being in that place. And developers, their role, if you go back, certainly, 20, 25 years ago, developers were kind of kept in the back room, right? They their job was to write code, and, they were measured on, lines of code per day or per month or per week or whatever the metric might have been. And, they weren't really seen as being, contributing direct value to the business the way today developers are seen as being kind of really in a leadership position. So IT overall has the ability to make a company be successful or to inhibit a company from being successful. And if you ever, I think the best case study, and I'm sure this will be written about for years to come in the business schools, is when you think about what happened in the early months of the pandemic, right? There were organizations that were well positioned from a technology perspective, that they were able to just simply adjust and keep running their business without any impact. But that there were a huge number of companies that were forced to make a very, very sudden pivot. And there's an example where if the developers and the skills that the company had and that developer unit of the business was able to understand the problem, was able to address the problem, and was able to do it quickly, they probably were there to rescue basically contribute to the survival of the business itself. And again, there are examples of companies that didn't make the pivot well, and examples of companies that did.
That's fantastic. I mean, there is so much knowledge and depth that you are providing in these answers. It's quite evident in terms of what you've been doing for almost a quarter century. It's amazing, actually. Now, we kind of started talking about it. I would love to hear your thoughts on AI, right? So AI is happening anywhere and everywhere. Google has done, gosh, Bard, then Gemini, then their Ultra Pro, all sorts of different versions. And a couple of days ago, they just announced Gamma, which is their open source model. There is Llama 2, there is Olama, and there's of course OpenAI, then there is Falco, there is Mistral, and like any industry, there are open models and closed models, and there's a massive debate happening that, particularly as we are heading towards Gen AI, we don't know when that's going to be, or AGI rather, automated general intelligence. As we are heading towards it, the whole relevance of open versus closed model, if it's not open, how do you trust it? How do you know it's responsible? How do you know it's ethical? You don't know what data it's training on. There is no attribution. So I want to understand, I want to hear your thoughts on open versus closed models today.
Yeah. So in general, let me talk about open versus closed in general first, but then I'll loop around to AI models specifically because I have some thoughts in both areas. So in general, my sense is that open can be slower to respond to an industry need. So, for example, when something needs to happen quickly, an organization typically will go out and build a solution. And in many cases, they turn around and they say, okay, we're going to open source this to the community now that it's at a usable level. And, you could argue that something like Kubernetes or Knative out of Google were examples of that, where Google drove that technology and then open sourced it a little further down the line, which we all know is not necessarily how the open source community likes to work. I mean, the community often, has a little bit of a pushback when something has been developed, pretty substantially by a single party, which is then released into the community. On the other hand, it's a way of getting things off the ground quickly and moving there. And so applying that notion to AI, I think it's fair to say that, at some level, getting, good models built quickly was probably something that needed to be done on a proprietary basis as opposed to an open basis. However, the industry has shown time and again that over time, the open source community responds, catches up to, and surpasses the surrounding technology. So while that may have not happened yet, we may have not gone to that surpassing stage. I think it's fair to assume that may well happen in some point in the next couple of years. One other thing I'll also mention with regards to artificial intelligence in particular, right? We've got these models that we're basing all this AI technology upon. And you're right, we want to know what's in those models, but at the same time, we want to know that the things that we don't want are not there, right?
Right.
In the case of a proprietary model, you can presume that whoever is building a proprietary model probably has some level of control over what's getting in there. I can't, if I were a malicious actor, I can't contribute something malicious to that closed proprietary model. Whereas I could try to slip something into an open model. And granted that the point of the community, the open source community, is to catch those intentionally malicious contributions. But we know that's going to happen. There are going to be bad actors who are going to try to mistrain these models.
Yeah. I think what you're talking about is, as a runner, I mean, I'm a runner, so my analogy kind of goes that way. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So in that sense, that's sort of what I'm trying to realize here. Sometimes a company come out of a proprietary model because they want to move fast, they want to deliver it. But then again, there is no attribution. There is no way by which, what is the training data? What is the model? What is the weight? What is the source code? Can I bring all of that? And again, the foundation models, as we think about them, not everybody can create a foundation model because the amount of resources, the amount of dollars, just sheer dollars and people and compute resources it takes is not possible for like a small, like I cannot create a foundation model, for example,
Right.
unless I have, millions of dollars sitting somewhere and people who are willing to work where I can pay them to create that. So I think that's the challenge that is always going to be there. Rachel, any thoughts on this topic?
Arun, I think she said she's having audio problems.
And I know you're having audio issues, so that's okay. We'll keep rolling, I guess, on this topic in that case. Now, do you think there are places where open is not the right answer? Like, we have talked about, how the benefits of open, how open, brings you diversity, how open brings you inclusivity, how open does not give you sort of the vendor lock-in. But are there places where open is not the right answer?
I think the answer is definitely yes. And in some respects, I mean, let me provide a couple of examples. I mean, so for example, if we were building a probe that's going into space and we're going to be sending it to Mars or some distant planet, it's going to be in service for years. And the open source community doesn't do well about supporting a snapshot in time. The open source community continues to roll forward with increasingly updated versions of a technology. So let's just say we take a snapshot of a particular set of open source software technologies that we want to build into something which is going to have a very, very long life. It means that very, very quickly, my organization that took that snapshot is going to be responsible to maintain that code for the long term, because the community will move on and leave you behind, and you can't necessarily embrace the updates and the changes that are coming down the road. So that's one area where you have to, open may be a good foundation, but ultimately it's kind of on you to maintain that. And the same thing holds true with years ago. I had a conversation with a vendor who had technology was in use and was aging, and they were trying to move the remaining customers off the aging technology. And I said, well, why don't you just simply give them a free upgrade for the remaining 5% of the people, so you don't have to support this old stuff? And the answer I got back was, well, the problem is it's on a naval ship and it's been deployed and it's not coming back yet. And we just can't physically make this update until that ship comes back to dry dock. So again, another example where there are points, there are places where technology is deployed where it cannot be updated on an ongoing basis, which means that it's not necessarily the best candidate for open source, but if it does use open source, it still needs to be, it's something where it has to be, the technology has to be snapshotted and then maintained by that individual entity for the long term.
Yeah, that's fair actually, because if there are places where you want to move at a certain predefined pace, where you want to control the pace on how often the updates happen, when the updates happen, what are the release cycle, what are the patch cycle. If you want to control that, then you really want to, then you may not be able to go the open source route, because open source community tends to move much faster, and they're all about like, okay, let me add more features, let me make it more sustainable, and that may not really align with your roadmap. So maybe you fork it off, or you maintain a version of your own, and then take it in-house and then do it. Rachel, any thoughts on that?
I wonder too if security plays a role. What I'm thinking about right now is how like the finance world runs on COBOL, and how that is problematic. Um, I'm wondering if security comes into it, or perceived lack of security. I know we do a lot of work at Intel, obviously, to work on this. The other thing, I mean, I think also sort of like someone said to me one time that open source is great at the beginning of sort of like a technology curve, or the end, right? And so in the middle is when I think people are trying to sort of make their money and stuff. And I wonder if that plays a role. Like I've seen with AI, I think the fact that like TensorFlow was open and PyTorch is open, that really sort of like made everything, like what we're seeing today, I think was because of that. Whereas I look at something not as like explosive, like VR and AR. Like I think that there hasn't been innovation there necessarily, although minus like the Apple Vision Pro looks pretty awesome. I think because it's been closed. I mean, that's more of a specific case. But then on the other hand, we see cloud, which is less open. So I think it's a play. I think it's there's a good place in the middle. I think there's reasons. I think security is a reason that people will bring up to have more of a closed source. I think, like you're saying, the maintaining, that's something I think we'll talk about a little bit later. But it doesn't happen by itself yet, that sort of like upkeep, unless AI is going to do
Well, I wonder if security is a real issue because when we look at the NVD, National Vulnerability Database, majority of the vulnerabilities are in closed source project than in open source project. Because as you know, Linus's law says, I think it's a quote from the Cathedral and the Bazaar, the book, and it says, given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow, and that beauty, that opportunity only exists in open source, and in a closed source environment, you are restricted and confined by only an org's eyeballs, as opposed to open source where
True.
global eyeballs could be put onto it, and then think, oh, I think I know what's happening because I have actually dealt with this in my some arcane thesis, and I know exactly what's happening here. That may not happen otherwise. So very cool. And we kind of talked about sort of the good and the bad examples of open. Rachel, you had a question about what makes open source. Get into that.
I did. So I think there's many answers to this, but like what makes sustainable, successful open source, right? Is it the communities? Is it the foundations that we've pulled together? Is it enterprises seeing the value as part of it? How do we make sure that it's the right mix? What is the right mix, and how do we sort of move that forward to keep open source sustainable?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I think the answer is that there's no one mix, right? It depends on the age of a project. It depends on the complexity of a project. It depends on who the sponsors are, who the whether there are foundations involved and so forth. And I would have to argue that at any particular project, over the course of its lifetime, that mix is going to change. So let's just say that a startup project maybe doesn't necessarily need a foundation involved right away because the technology has to establish itself as being viable, and maybe that's driven by a small community of individuals that are proponents of this technology, or maybe there's a startup that sees this as a business opportunity. They want to drive this forward, and at that point, you probably have a mix where, and by the way, I've seen this a lot over the years, where there's 3 or 4 contributors to the project. All of the contributions are coming from a single organization. The governance model is dominated by a single organization. And that may be the only way you can get a project off the ground at times. But as the project begins to build some momentum and people start to take interest in that project, it could be that at some point you've got to open up the governance model, for example, and bring in a more diversified group of interested individuals to help organize and direct the project, mainly because if you don't do that, people start to feel like, gee, I don't have any influence over this project. And the organization that it does have influence over the project has some commercial ambition that doesn't necessarily benefit me. So over time, that mix has to change. I do think over the long term, a project that is successful needs to have a community and a community that extends beyond a single vendor, right? But in addition to that, we need to have some form of an open governance model, and ideally a foundation. But clearly, the foundations, between Apache and Eclipse and Linux Foundation and so forth, we don't have enough foundational capacity for every single open source project to have a foundation backing it, right? So some of these projects are not going to have a foundation. So as a result, they need to be as inviting and open as possible to other parties. So fundamentally, I'm of the opinion that it's also important for there to be a vendor involved, and not because the project can't exist without the vendor, but because some customers are unable to adopt open source technology if it's not packaged in a very consumable manner. So lots of organizations say, I really like that technology, I want to use it, but I don't want to invest in a team of open source software experts that are going to be able to manage the bits and patch the flaws and that sort of thing. I really want to outsource that to somebody that will take care of that for me. And that's really where the commercial support vendors have come from, and why they have a key role there. So again, sorry, I don't feel like I answered your question other than to say that it depends, right?
Well, and I think that's important to know, that there is variability. I think that there needs to be diversity, and that's the thing to check on, right? That's the thing to make sure that there are individual contributors, there are enterprises, there are foundations, and make sure it's, and I don't know who this is, I guess it's like everyone, make sure that it doesn't lean too much any particular way. I think it's that healthy mix. Uh, and that's just one way to look at the mix, right? So I just think it's important to be self-aware. I guess that's what I'm thinking.
No, this is fantastic actually, and there is a lot of questions coming from the audiences as well. So I think before we dig into that, I think Al, one of the points that you talked about is sort of multi-org governance. A vendor needs to be involved. I think it's super important. If people are doing it in a spare time, then it's not sustainable. Because you know, I don't know very many people, who have the competency that okay, I'm just going to clone GitHub.com/Kubernetes and I'm going to do that in deployment from there, because it's not just the day one, it's the day two. How do you do security patches? How do you do updates? How do you make sure you are staying in sync with the upstream, all the innovation that is happening? You may not want all the features. How do you get support across multiple cloud providers? I think that's where people buy into the dream of open source, that okay, I love that this is a single API. I'm not going to get logged into a cloud provider. So today, for example, I may be using EKS on Amazon. And if I like the EKS Kubernetes promise, that's great because they're upstream compatible. And then tomorrow, if I want to move to, hypothetically, I can go to GKE or AKS, Azure Kubernetes Service. In that sense, same thing with, JDK, for example, that, hey, I just want to be compliant with Open JDK, whether I use Oracle JDK or Eclipse Adoptium or Amazon Corretto, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to take one of the downstream distros and that serves my need. Some really good questions here from the audience. The first one here is, I think this talks about our point about open versus closed. And I believe NVD is NVIDIA. It says 2x3 closed versus 1x3 open on NVIDIA. And maybe it's referring to that, how their CUDA model is fully closed, is kind of controlled, it's like a proprietary wall that they define what the innovation needs to happen. And I'm not sure what's open at NVIDIA though.
I wonder, is he talking about that vulnerability database? Remember you were saying?
You know what? You're right. Maybe that's what it is. Yeah, 2x3 closed versus 1x3 open. There you go. Yeah, national. That's the comment we made earlier. Okay, that makes sense. Because like NVIDIA and open, I won't really use them in the same sentence.
No, but that backs what you said though, that
correct.
There are more security issues in closed, which makes
That's
sense.
Correct. That's correct. Thank you for that comment. I'm clarifying that NVIDIA is National Vulnerability Database. And yeah, percent of open source versus closed. Gerard, hello Gerard, made a comment. That's not to say there aren't solution on closed technologies. For example, the case of bug bounties.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely cases, when you're doing the bug bounties, how do you handle those bug bounties? Do you doing them in an open manner or a closed manner? You want to make sure that your bugs are addressed in a very quick manner so you can move them in a faster pace. There's a comment rather by Prakhar Mishra. He says, I like the idea of having a snapshot and provide support on something Red Hat used to do. And I don't know. I mean, I have comments on this. Al, Rachel, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, I suspect that that comment is probably referring to some of the CentOS changes that Red Hat has made. But let me just step away from it for a second and say, I mean, in fact, that's what most commercial open source software support providers do. So Red Hat does create a snapshot of Linux. They fork it for the duration of that product's life cycle. And they go through that, and then there's another version of Red Hat Enterprise Linux, which is built off of the upstream Fedora and now CentOS efforts, which evolves into the version next of Red Hat Enterprise Linux. In that sense, that's there. I think what if I'm reading between the lines, I suspect the implication is that that's not free, right? And that's a fair criticism that for some customers that's a difficult thing for them to embrace, but at the same time, when you're when you're looking for support and you're expecting it to be free, you have to think about, are you getting what you're paying for, right? And I'm not suggesting that the community doesn't do a great job. The community does do a great job, But again, for some customers, they want to make sure that when they have a problem 11 o'clock at night on a Saturday night, there's somebody at the other end of the phone that can answer the question when you have a problem.
Yeah, I mean, you can tap into the amorphous community. If your system is down, you may not want to file a Jira ticket or a GitHub issue and say, let's wait, let somebody responds, and then I can go. Somebody's going back and forth in the Q&A, and then I'm going to go patch my system. You really want that, one throat to choke, as they say, that my system is down. You're providing commercial support on this. How do we get this going? Now, another theory that I've seen around that is, I think you hinted upon that, Al. There is upstream, which is Linux. Then there is midstream, which is Red Hat Fedora. And then there is downstream, which is sort of the Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And I've seen, I was in China last year, and that concept being very prominent in China. Open Analyst, Open Euler, all of these, they've created those midstream versions of their own, because they're creating those versions and then they are used by a specific cloud service provider in China. What do you think is the philosophy? Because I know sometimes the Linux kernel may not be able to take that rapid pace of patches, but that allows them to innovate faster on the midstream. But do you think we are forking the concept already over there?
Well, Arun, I don't want to get into politics because that's not my area of expertise. But just from where I sit, I mean, there's a certain political aspect to this where I think China in particular, but frankly, I think it's fair for other countries to be concerned about, what if Western culture decided to shut off access to open source software, and how do we protect ourselves from that? Now, you and I know that that's not how open source software works, and there are mirror sites for just about every technology that are spread around the world and so forth. So the ability, like if any one entity said, hey, we're going to shut off access to the Linux kernel for everybody except for countries A, B, C, and D, I don't think anybody could really do that, right? But the sense of we need to make sure that we have access to these technology. I think that's part of what leads to some countries or regions, trying to build a midstream copy of technology. Now, the only problem with that, and this is not a political statement at all, but I think Linus Torvalds had said this years ago, something to the effect of, sooner or later, the need to keep up with the continued evolution of open source brings everybody back to the main line, right? Because you can't, if you go outside of the main line, what you're doing is you're in effect setting yourself up to build a separate stream of updates and patches and fixes that you have to do forever, unless you have intentions to go back to the mainline stream of that particular code set. And again, that's what all the commercial open source software distributions do, right? They take a snapshot, they fork it, they support it, but in the meantime, they're working with the upstream community on the next iteration of the product. And when the next iteration comes along, they try to do their best to make sure that the previous fork has as much compatibility as possible to the new version. And then at some point they bring that out. But that's that's a hard thing to do, really.
And I think that kind of goes back to the philosophy that we were talking earlier. You want to go faster, go alone. You want to go together. You want to go far, you go together. So maybe once in a while it's okay where you fork off, you create that midstream, you're doing rapid iteration over there. Then you've done the experimentation. Then you're actually, putting the changes in production, in your production environment. And that gives a proof point to the main line that, hey, you know what? This is actually working. We're not just smoking here, but this is really true deal, working at scale. And this is how the feature is going to be implemented, because end of the day in open source is the king, right? So, once you show the proof is in the pudding that, okay, this is what the source code is, this is how scale it is working at. I think that's amazing. Another interesting question here is, we don't need to have a foundation to support all projects. There is LF, Linux Foundation, that has about 1,000 plus projects now, Eclipse Foundation, Apache Foundation, and several other, Rust Foundation. Do we need a foundation to support a project? Like, what are the advantages, disadvantages of being in a part of the foundation?
Well, from where I sit, and I bet Rachel has a lot to say about this as well. From my sense is that, having a foundation involved with supporting a project gives a project a lot of credibility. And by the way, you get an automatic governance model that's communal that's open, that's accessible to multiple parties. I think that those are all real positives. But it's true that maybe it would be nice if we could have a foundation behind every project, but that's impossible, right? There are hundreds of thousands of projects or whatever. There's some enormous number of projects, and you just can't have a foundation devoting resources to every single one of those projects. And many of those projects don't need a foundation behind them. So yeah, I'm in full agreement. So Rachel, like I said, I'm sure you have thoughts there too.
I mean, I think the same thing. I think it does give it some legitimacy and validation, right, to enterprises that are going to use it, where it affects their business outcomes. I think it also can come with perks because there's money, right? I mean, like, there's governance, but then there's also membership fees that you can use to then, make your community bigger, get some more shine on the project. But absolutely no, not they don't all have to do that, but it's I guess it has to do with your goals for the project.
Yeah, I mean, if I started a project tomorrow and I started going out to Fortune 500 companies saying, "Hey, I'm starting a project. You want to sponsor it?" I don't think I'd get any callbacks.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. No, I think there are advantages and disadvantages of being part of the foundation, because if you are starting the project, when you're going to a foundation, it does give you that neutral third party, because you don't own the trademark, you don't own the copyright, everything belongs to the foundation. And that really allows other parties more comfortable to start contributing and collaborating. And again, I'm biased because I've been involved with Linux Foundation for many years now, and I'm on multiple boards within the Linux Foundation. So that's sort of the lens that I see it with. But all the IT support, all the marketing support, all the governance support that you get as part of the foundation is phenomenal, because otherwise, if you're not part of the foundation, you have to do that work anyway. Like, how do you promote the project? How do you market the project? And then if you see sort of the larger events like KubeCon and the Open Source Summit and all, these are again funded by the Linux Foundation. And so you can talk about any open source topic here, but you're more likely to get accepted. And again, this is based upon no scientific data, but if you are a CNCF project, then there is already a lot of awareness about the project, and the program committee is likely going to know about it. But if you're not part of the foundation, they say, what is this project? I got to find out what about it. What is the credibility? And I think one of the parts that we were talking earlier is about the multi-org governance. If the project has contributors from a single vendor versus multiple vendors, because that makes the project that much more legit, as opposed to foundation making it more legit. To me, really, what I'm looking for is what is the diversity of maintainers in the project? Like, is it truly coming from multiple people across the world? So I think those are some interesting topics. Okay, Prakhar, one more question here. Beautiful. There is one more option which HashiCorp took, the BPL license. How it impacts contributions?
Well, I mean, HashiCorp, their technology, was never, the core intellectual property was never open source. They've always released a snapshot of their technology, and their contributors were, bound by some form of a contributor license agreement, I believe, so that when they made a contribution, it would become ownership on part of HashiCorp. And when they changed their licensing, I think part of what they're trying to do is to, the best of my understanding, at least, is that they're trying to limit the ability of other organizations to stand up a service based on their technology and monetize it directly without licensing anything from HashiCorp. Now, is their prerogative to do that since they own the underlying intellectual property? It clearly didn't resonate very well with the industry, and that's why we have the Open Tofu project, for example, now in the Linux Foundation, which I thought was interesting because that, in theory, that's how open source software is supposed to work, right? If the community disagrees with where the organization driving the governance is going, the community can say, okay, well, we're not going to go that direction. We're going to take this technology, fork it, and go forward. So in fact, that's just demonstrating that open source software, the process of building open source software works the way it's intended to.
But what do you think about a company like HashiCorp, or for whatever reason, any company changes the license midstream, because initially they're riding the bandwagon that, oh, open source, open source, open source. So they're building the community, they're quote unquote fooling the developers that no, we're going to stay open source forever. And then one fine day, because of the VC pressure or because they need to meet their numbers for whatever reason, again, no stupid reason, but some for whatever reason they change the license midstream. What do you think about that? Is that like a violation of trust of the developers? And then like the open tofu effort is now like a fork and part of the Linux Foundation. So what is your thinking around that?
Well, so for the developers themselves, I mean, they're still able to use the HashiCorp technology. The licensing change really affected organizations that were spinning up competitive implementations of Terraform, right? It was so that the developers who are contributing to the project can still use it, or corporations are still able to use the technology if they choose to. So in that sense, it that move that HashiCorp made certainly got a lot of visibility and a lot of talk in the industry. But for most organizations, unless they were subscribing to a commercial implementation of Terraform from somebody other than HashiCorp, they probably weren't really affected directly. And
I think
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, to your point, how big a change was it if the underlying IP was really with them anyways? I think it's more about the timing and how it looked, frankly. Do you know what I mean? It was kind of like the rug being pulled out from under you. So I think it was unfortunate. I think it's more that. I think it's more the perception of that. And like you said, I mean, the community is like, that's cool. We'll go do this thing over here.
Yeah, it's more about the optics in terms of how it's perceived. And the community says, okay, you know what, screw it. We want to keep it open source. There is enough motivation for us to keep it open source. And they immediately forked off the project. At least the last time I heard, there were 35 active developers on it, 1 to 3 maintainers from a wide range of companies, and that contributor diversity is really what makes the project rich. And I think there may be some initial euphoria for the next few months, but then how it sustains, we talked about sort of the maintainer burnout as one of the reasons. How does that hang out, after a year, after a two? Because end of the day, companies could keep putting their resources in there, but now they have an immediate product need. It's like, do I put this developer in the open source versus pull that project? I don't know. Do this product need first.
To mention, so we did, as you know, did a survey at the end of last year, beginning of this year. 650 developers. Number one challenge faced is maintainer burnout at 45%. So that's a problem, keeping that going. That brings it back to, is it a fan favorite? Does it need a foundation? When it gets to a certain point, it needs some structure in there. So I think we'll see, right? I mean, that's the community that is so important wherever it comes from.
Yeah, but the community has to be more than 2 or 3 people, right?
Oh yes.
And you can have a community of 100 people, but if still only 2 people are contributing, you're making submissions of code, that's still a problem. And that's what we need. Is we need a community where there's more people actually
That's actually my worry, is that more and more people are like, yay, everything's open source, I'm just going to use it, and aren't contributing back. That's super important to keep sustainability high.
And by the way, the developer burnout discussion, there's actually other secondary aspects of that. I mean, number one is, can we keep these individuals interested in doing this? And by the way, there are companies out there, like there's a company I spent a lot of time talking to over the years called Tidelift, and they actually compensate maintainers on behalf of corporate users that are using a particular technology, and they want to make sure that maintainer stays engaged. And certainly, burnout is a little easier to fight if you're getting paid for your time, right? If you're doing it for free at 11 o'clock at night, it's going to get old, right? So that's part of it. But the other piece of it that worries me is that we've got this portfolio that's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger of open source software. And over time, there are projects that are going to basically not be supported by anybody. And those technologies are still being used somewhere in somebody's infrastructure. And, these things they become security problems.
Yeah, no, I think it's super important that, that we address that maintainer burnout. And by the way, I have seen that maintainer burnout in a non-foundation project as well as a foundation project. I mean, you would think Kubernetes, would not have that problem, but people who have been working on Kubernetes for almost a decade now, because I think next year we are celebrating a decade of Kubernetes. They're having a serious burnout because particularly the pandemic really had a massive impact on it, because a lot of it, without realizing, a lot of the work was getting done by being at KubeCon, by sitting across the table. People were not fighting their personal problems. I think all of those things definitely add up in terms of, so it doesn't matter whether it's a foundation owned project or a non-foundation, like an independent project. The burnout could definitely happen for a wide variety of reasons. But and Al, you kind of brought up a good point as well, that if the maintainer is paid for, where is part of their annual review plan that, okay, 50% of your time goes towards community work, and I give you that 50% of the time, as opposed to like, yeah, you can do this work, but we're not going to incentivize you for this. So here is the work that you have to do 100% of the time for the company, and then on top of that, whatever you want to do is good brownie points. But when it comes to focal or promotion or review time, I'm not going to count towards that. So I think those are the things that could definitely lead, and that's why having that open source culture as opposed to strategy in the company is so much more important.
Arun, I would argue that it's burnout is only one aspect of it. I would argue that there's probably one or two others, and one you mentioned up front, where at some point the Linux kernel maintainers are going to retire, right? So it's aging out, not just burnout. But in addition, let's think about it from a career perspective. If I'm a developer and I've been working on Kubernetes for 10 years, I'm worried about my career. Where's my next opportunity going to come? Am I going to be really narrowly defined as being just an expert in this one technology? And for a lot of people, they want to diversify and get other experience. And over time, you can expect that people are going to want to move on to another project just simply because it's good for their career.
Yeah, and that does bring up an interesting point. See, because now with AI as a new hotness, if a new developer who's getting into the career now, they say, "Oh, I just want to work at Meta or whatever the company or Nvidia, where I can create these new models and open model, closed model. I don't care, but I want to be part of the foundation model craziness that is around happening." But without realizing, those models, they still need to run on an underlying kernel. And if kernel maintainers are aging out, who's going to keep the kernel secure? So I think that diversity is super important. That where are you relevant? Where are you contributing? And end of the day, you got to see what makes sense for you.
Does that go back to like open source is really about like education? Right. And so it's how people learn. And I think it shows, again, about the health of the community and making sure you're bringing in new people all the time. Right. There's like a churn. That's tiring as well, I would imagine. But I think that's really important. And I guess that's yet another thing that you have to do to manage a project.
Very much so. Yeah, I mean, in CNCF, for example, they have a contributor experience working group, where they're constantly looking that if what can they do to lower the bar for contributions to any cloud native project. Because oftentimes people think, oh, I don't know coding and I cannot contribute, which is so untrue. Last year or so, I wrote a blog post that talks about 10 non-code ways by which you can contribute to an open source project. So I think if interest has changed, if you don't want to be a programmer anymore, you want to do more of a project management or architect role or a lead role, or you want to do bug triage, whatever you want to do, there are lots and lots of different opportunities. Another comment by Gerard. Programmer burnout and churn and rejuvenation is a common problem across the software industry, not just open source. So true.
Everywhere.
Yeah. No, I agree. We are coming to the end of this. What advice would you give for young developers who are starting their career?
Wow. So the industry's changed an awful lot in the last 2 years. And at this point, I mean, generative AI has become clearly an enabler for developers. And one of the things that in my work in this research area, both for open source and for developers and so forth, we've been referring to this notion of developers have to become curators of software. So in other words, their primary job is not writing lines of code, but rather using this generative AI tool to build code, being able to analyze the output of that Gen AI created code, make sure it does what it needs to do, it's quality code and so forth. Then we're going to be curating things that we're going to get directly from the open source community. So we're going to pull down some code from GitHub or from from other repository, and I'm going to start to integrate these things together. So the job of the developer shifts from that of a person who's charged with just starting with a blank screen and writing lines of code to someone who actually takes pieces of code from a lot of different sources, ties them together, makes them work well together, and have that have skills with regards to trying to be able to do a good job curating this code and picking the right pieces of code, integrating them together well, and making sure they perform well. So I think that the role of developer over the next couple of years shifts quite a bit from that of being somebody that writes code to somebody that actually integrates pieces of code together and then does a really good job of doing the testing and evaluation on the performance and the applicability of the end result they put together.
Yeah, I was reading, again, I was listening to the podcast Hard Fork this morning, and they were talking about Gamma that they have launched as an open source model. I believe it's a 7 billion parameter model, but they're talking about how I think the largest model that has the context available is of 200,000 words right now. But Gamma changes the game where it can take 1 million words, million tokens. That's 5 times the larger than any other token. And what they were talking about is what that million words mean. You can put massive code bases into this model and say, find out the vulnerabilities, find out where the code may not work, and let sort of the Gamma, and again, you can create sort of a specialized model around it, but it can then start churning out all of that information and say, so I think you're right in the sense that don't shy away from it, but rather embrace this as a powerful tool that you have and see how you could be a more effective user. It's not about the lines of code, it's about that putting that human intelligence, at least until AGI comes around.
Yeah, I think curiosity, right? I think that would be for beyond developers. I was sitting here thinking what I would add for developers, and I think something that is not often overlooked, but sometimes overlooked is professional skills, being able to translate what you're doing to other stakeholders. That I think everybody's becoming more educated about technology, but may not be quite as educated
Yes.
as you. And so I think that's really important too.
Yeah, and there are some suggestions from the chat as well. Learn open source licensing, which is hard. Learn GitHub, get involved in open source projects, and understand what vulnerabilities mean. So I think those are really good advice as well. I'll really coming to the end. How does the retirement life look like?
Well, Arun, one of the things that's probably scariest is that I don't get to interact with folks like you and Rachel on a daily basis, and that part of it is I miss that. I really, really do. On the other hand, as I mentioned to you before we got on this podcast, this webcast, is that for the first time in 45 years of working, I'm actually able to go a day without an emergency popping up on my phone, and it does two things. One is it's incredibly freeing that I can just go do what I want to do today, not worry about something popping up. On the other hand, there's a little bit of it like, gee, they don't really need me anymore.
Yeah, that FOMO is gonna take some time for that FOMO to get over it.
Yeah.
How's the horse riding coming along?
I'm doing great. The horse is doing good, and he and I are getting along well.
Fantastic. And I can understand because during pandemic I would talk, like I used to work at Apple around that time, and a lot of the people who had dogs in their house, initially it was uncomfortable for them, like, what, you were staying the whole day, and slowly the pets start getting used to it. And when the people started going back to work, like, what do you mean you're not going to be at home? Because now I'm used to it. So I can imagine that off and on relationship with the horse is like, oh, you're gonna ride me at 2 p.m. in the afternoon now because you're home. That's fantastic. And Al, you have a fan following here. Cindy Borowick made a comment. So glad you're still sharing your insights, Al. And Al, I think I agree. Retirement is still far away for me. I haven't thought about it, but to me, honestly, the most rewarding part of the job is really, getting on these group conversations. And as they say, once you're riding the horse, you don't want to get off the horse. You just keep riding it, because once you get off, you don't know if you're going to be able to get back onto it or not. Is there anything that I should have asked that I didn't ask?
Gosh, I mean, this has been a really great conversation, and I think we covered an awful lot of ground in an hour. I can't. Nothing comes to mind for me, at least. Maybe Rachel has some thoughts.
Yeah, Rachel.
I don't think so. I think we touched on some good topics. I'm sure we could do another whole hour, but maybe that's down the road.
Down the road, absolutely. Al, you are always up for whenever you want to talk. You have my email address. I would always love. I mean, I've enjoyed talking to you over the years, and I would be happy to bring you back here anytime. Or if you happen to be in Bay Area, always up for a coffee or lunch.
Perfect. I may take you up on that.
All right. Thank you, folks. Bye bye. I'm going to end the stream now.
Thanks a lot.